Today I'm going to talk about the book of Deuteronomy, probably one of the most important books in the Old Testament from the standpoint of salvation history. In Hebrew, the book is called Devarim, which simply means words, but in the Greek, it has always had the name Deuteronomy or Deuteros Nomos, meaning second law. But what is the second law in Deuteronomy, and how does it differ from the first law, sometimes called the priestly law, the one that we find sprinkled in big chunks of Exodus, almost all of the book of Leviticus, and a decent portion of the book of Numbers? Well, to answer this question, let's first consider that St. Thomas Aquinas, in his treatise on the law, divided it into three kinds of precepts. There were moral precepts. These would be things like the Ten Commandments and so forth. Then there would be judicial precepts. These would be things that speak to the governance, the behavior of future kings, administration of justice, court cases, how they're to be heard with fairness to all parties, and so on. Then finally there are the ceremonial precepts. These relate to anything from types and forms of sacrifices, how they're to be offered, to the liturgical calendar, to regulations for how altars are to be constructed, and what officiating priests must wear. As for the moral precepts, apart from some pretty minuscule differences, they're basically the same. The same Ten Commandments appear in Exodus as appear in Deuteronomy. And the juridical precepts, or the judicial precepts, actually most of these are found in Deuteronomy, since those laws are overwhelmingly concerned with practical issues of governance. And Deuteronomy is intended for the Israelite monarchy, primarily once it is established in the land. This is one big difference between it and the book of Leviticus. What about the ceremonial laws? Well, these are everywhere you look in Leviticus. Not only the different kinds of sacrifices, priestly consecrations, dietary laws, detailed prescriptions for feasts like Passover and Tabernacles, and fasts like on the Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur. There are also detailed distinctions between what is pure, what is clean and unclean, always carefully connected to external action, namely to what is holy, holy, holy to the Lord God Almighty. Deuteronomy, by contrast, is less concerned with the details of how you do the sacrifices, so much as that when you do them, you got to make sure that you put aside something for the poor and the needy. Deuteronomy is more concerned with what we would term social justice, care for widows and orphans, the poor, the needy, and so on and so forth. But we still have not answered the question, why have a second law that in so many respects just parallels the first law with a whole new covenant ratification ceremony? Why do this? Well, perhaps one clue can be found in the New Testament in the letter to the Hebrews. Hebrews 7:12 reads, "Where there's a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well." And yes, this happened. Numbers 25, when at Baal Peor, Israel played the harlot with the daughters of Moab, and Phinehas took it upon himself to slay an Israelite and his Moabite girlfriend in flagrante delicto. One of the few X-rated scenes we actually see in the Bible. But the point here is that it was at this event that the priesthood became confined by divine oath to the heirs of Phinehas, instead of to the broader line of Aaron. So there's a change in the priesthood here. And then in the Deuteronomic Code, the law portion begins in Deuteronomy 4:3, again at Baal Peor in the plains of Moab. So we could see a parallel here, just as the sin of the golden calf in Exodus 34 is associated with the origins of the Levitical priesthood and eventually the Levitical priestly code, so also the sin of Baal Peor, committed by the second generation of Israelites, is associated with the Deuteronomic Code. But how does Deuteronomy fit into salvation history more broadly? Why would God have ordained it so that two parallel law codes existed side by side, as it were? How does this fit into salvation history? Well, the greatest clue to solving this mystery is not actually found anywhere in the Pentateuch at all. In fact, it's found in the book of the prophet Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 25, 23, and 24, the prophet makes this statement regarding the Deuteronomic law. He says, "Moreover, I swore to them," speaking in Yahweh's voice, "I swore to them in the wilderness that I would scatter them among all the nations and disperse them through all the countries, because they had rejected my statutes and profaned my Sabbaths." Wow. That's sort of strange, right? Ezekiel is reading the law as though the Babylonian exile was not merely a hypothetical possibility, but an inevitability, something that God swore to bring about for disobedience. Already disobedience either committed in the past or disobedience solemnly predicted in the future by Yahweh. But no, that couldn't be right. I mean, he couldn't really mean that the whole law of Deuteronomy was a setup for failure. I mean, what kind of God would do that? Give a whole law that he's not expecting to be kept? Well, read on. Ezekiel 25:25 says, "I gave them statutes that were not good, and ordinances by which they could not have life." Huh? How can that be? I gave them statutes that were not good, and ordinances by which they could not have life? Well, there you have it. How? Why? How was the Deuteronomic Code set up for failure, and why? Well, some have pointed out that in a few areas the Deuteronomic Code was actually more lax than the one in Leviticus. For instance, Deuteronomy permitted divorce, while Leviticus never actually mentions divorce. Also, in Deuteronomy 12, 15 through 28, we find that Israelites are actually allowed to slaughter their own meat, as opposed to what it says in Leviticus 17, and this is doing it without involving a priestly sacrifice. So the ability to kill one's own meat without having to pay a Levite is a major concession to Israelite meat lovers, we could say. And Deuteronomy, therefore, was a major force in secularizing the day-to-day life of the average Israelite. That's a major change in individual life. Ezekiel actually seems to be complaining about that. But in one very crucial respect, Deuteronomy was not more lax than Leviticus, but actually infinitely more strict. You see, under the Levitical code, when an Israelite committed sins or was ritually impure, unclean, there actually were elaborate liturgical procedures to go through to gain readmittance to the community. Making certain sacrifices, ritual bathings, presenting yourself to the priest, etc. For many sins at an individual level, forgiveness was possible. Sin in Leviticus was more external, extrinsic, based on actions that people do, and uncleanness that was visibly apparent. This is why Leviticus, though it holds out the possibility of future exile if Israel becomes impure, this is something that can be rectified through ritual action. Leviticus 18:5 predicts or says that the law will bring life. But not so in Deuteronomy. Because the law of Deuteronomy so emphasizes sin as ultimately an internal phenomenon, nowhere in the entire book actually is it suggested how Israel might obtain forgiveness for sin, or indeed for failing to love the law with all their heart, all their soul, and all their strength. This is why there's, in fact, no escape from the covenant curses. The Deuteronomic law is really ultimately all about the heart, telling the hearers time and time again that the heart is where the teachings of the law must go. Deuteronomy tells Israel in chapter 10, verse 15 and 16, that because the Lord has set his heart in love with Israel, therefore Israel must circumcise their own heart so that she would no longer be stubborn. But how could she do this? It would require profound cardiac surgery, really soul surgery that only God himself could do. So Deuteronomy 36 offers the final ray of hope for a hopelessly gloomy forecast. Only after the exile from Israel happens will God ingather the people back and restore their fortunes. And this time, God himself will circumcise the heart of Israel so that for once and for all, she might love the Lord with all her heart, all her soul, and that she might live. As St. Augustine once put it, the law was given so that grace might be sought. And nothing could set the heart of Israel in seeking grace quite like the humiliation of exile and the apparent forfeiture of all the blessings promised to Abraham. But the end game, grace was given so that the law might be kept. So, how well have you kept up with this video? How well have you set its teachings upon your heart? We'll now find out.